Is that the vision in Trump's head? I don't know. It doesn't look that way because Trump doesn't seem ready to hand Ukraine off to Russia. On the other hand, he's not doing a lot to defend Ukraine. The national security strategy says, yes, we're going back to the Monroe Doctrine, but we're going to defend Taiwan and freedom of navigation up to the first island chain. That's not great power spheres of influence. That's American hegemony, and that's the forward deployment of American forces. Were we to go back to that world, it would really be going back to the 19th century.
How is Russia losing allies around the world? What implications could Iranian protests have? Could Donald Trump annex Greenland? How much money and political support does the Kremlin have to continue a war of attrition against Ukraine? All these questions I'm about to discuss with my today guest, Charles Kupchan. He is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and professor of international affairs at Georgetown University in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and Department of Government. Great to have you with us, Charles.
Very good to join you.
Recent geopolitical events have revealed that Russian allies around the world can't count on Putin in the most difficult moment. Assad, Maduro, and now Khamenei. How this affects trust, relations, and potential cooperation inside the so-called axis of evil?
Well, I think that Russia has been hard-pressed to find real allies for quite some time now. And that problem just got worse after the Russians went in to Ukraine in 2014 and then the full-scale invasion in 2022. And so if you were to say, who's on Russia's side right now, it's basically Iran and North Korea with the Chinese there in a no-limit strategic partnership. And then the Russians have little toeholds elsewhere in Africa until recently, in Venezuela, some holdovers from the Russian role in Cuba. But we're not looking at a Russia that enjoys a great deal of influence in many parts of the world. And what happened in Venezuela is in some ways a setback because the Russians and the Chinese, for that matter, had invested in the country and had good relations with Maduro. And so the Russian relationship, the provision of air defenses to Venezuela, for example, all of that proved rather useless. And so this is yet another setback for Russia. How big a setback? Not a big one. In some ways, I think what Trump has done is in Venezuela is probably making Putin and Xi Jinping happy for two different reasons. One is it's caused a great deal of division inside the United States and inside the Atlantic Alliance. Everybody is now scratching their head and saying, what is Trump doing? What is he going to do in Greenland? And then the other is, in some ways, Trump's intervention in Venezuela and his reinstatement of the Monroe Doctrine plays into the desires of both Russia and China to have regional spheres of influence. He is in some ways saying, hey, might makes right. The powerful do what they want. The weak do what they must. Those are the kinds of statements and behaviors that make Beijing and Moscow pretty comfortable.
Yeah, Bloomberg reported that Iran has sold missiles to Russia worth almost $3 billion. It emphasizes to what extent their military cooperation is deep. How events in Iran could directly and indirectly influence Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, I think that the developments that we've seen unfold in the Middle East represent very serious setbacks for Russia. It's in part because of Iran, and Russia basically didn't lift a finger during the Israeli attack, which Donald Trump joined in the final hours. Russian air defenses were easily taken down by Israeli aircraft and electronic countermeasures. And as a consequence, I think Russia lost a foothold and a level of influence in the Middle East. And then you had Syria, with the toppling of the Syrian regime. The new government in Damascus has been a serious setback for Russia, for Iran, for their influence in the region. And now you have unrest in Iran that could perhaps lead to the downfall of the Islamic Republic. I think we're as close to that outcome as we've ever been. And that could mean a breach in the relationship with Russia. It could mean the end of arms sales to Russia. Does it mean the end of Russia's war against Ukraine? No, I don't think so. I think one of the things that we've seen going back to 2014 and 2022 is that if there's a weak link in the strategy of containing Russia, it's the sanctions. And in a globalized world where Russia has support from North Korea, from China, where it can trade with Turkey and Central Asia, and Georgia and other countries, it's very hard to shut down the Russian economy and to prevent items that have military applications from going in. So a toppling of the regime in Iran would be a big setback for Russia. I don't see it as having an immediate and huge impact on what Russia is doing in Ukraine.
When it comes to broader perspective, what could happen if current Iranian regime would fall? What positive and negative geopolitical implications, not in Ukraine, not in Russia, in the world in general, do you see?
Well, you know, there's a good scenario and there's a bad scenario. The good scenario is that the regime falls and that a real troublemaker in the Middle East is gone. And let's be honest here. You know, I mean, the Islamic Republic was established in 1979 during the revolution, toppled the Shah, and for the next many decades, right? 79 until 2025, that's a pretty long run. Iran has been a real troublemaker, supporting proxies in Iraq, in Syria, Hamas in Gaza, proxies in Yemen that have caused real trouble. It's what we call the axis of resistance. Unfortunately, that axis has been dismantled, and now Iran itself may disappear. And we also know that Iran has been a major state sponsor of terrorism, with attacks carried out in many far-flung places. So I don't think you're going to find a lot of countries around the world that are deeply upset if this regime falls. The downside risk is what happens should it fall. Will there be some kind of peaceful transition? Will there be an opposition that comes to power? Or does Iran turn into something like a failed state and look more like Iraq after the US invasion, or Syria after the civil war, with all kinds of regional powers trying to take advantage of it, with different ethnic groups inside the country trying to separate from Iran? Who knows what could transpire? And I'm guessing that one of the reasons that the Trump administration is being careful about the potential use of force is the idea that if there is to be change, or the change really does need to come from within, it needs to be organic, and that an Iranian regime that's toppled by the United States, with an opposition that isn't somehow attached to the United States, I think is much less stable than one in which there is a natural grassroots revolution that gets rid of a regime that has not delivered for the Iranian people.
At the same time, we have a very important question, I think. What will be with oil prices if regime falls?
You know, again, hard to say. One target that was on the table during the Israeli attack and the US attack, oil installations. And those oil installations were not hit. I'm assuming that in discussions in the White House and perhaps in Israel now, there is the possibility of going after oil installations. The downside is it would disrupt the flow of oil, the production of oil, and have an impact on oil prices. And in that respect, I'm guessing that you're not going to see strikes against oil platforms were there to be an American military operation. I think it would be more strikes against military targets, those forces that are out there in the streets that are killing the protesters. It's also the case that oil prices have been dropping recently, in part because I think there's a sense that more oil from Venezuela is going to be coming online. That having been said, it's clear that Trump's dreams of American companies rushing into Venezuela to pump oil are just dreams, because we're not yet in a situation in which major American oil companies are going into a country that is very unstable and that requires billions of dollars in investment in infrastructure.
But frankly speaking, do you believe in US strike on Iran, or is it just intimidation?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's a very tough call. Do I believe that strikes against Iran are in active discussion? Yes. Do I believe that the Trump administration feels empowered by the success of its strikes so far, and in particular, the strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities, the surgical operation to remove Maduro from power without the loss of a single American life, surgical strikes against ISIS targets in the Middle East? I think there's a sense that the United States can and should use military power to shape outcomes. But I also think that there is justifiable concern about what happens if the United States intervenes in Iran, and what happens if regime change is somehow seen as having American fingerprints on it. So, if this unrest continues, if the killing continues, my best guess is that the United States will use force. But that is just a guess. I am just speculating on the likely outcome.
Yeah, I got you. What is Trump's true desire when it comes to Greenland? Because Denmark is a member of NATO and its security is warranted by NATO. So all Trump's words that he wants to protect Greenland from China or Russia sound weird.
Weird, I think, is putting it very nicely. I would say that what we're hearing about Greenland is otherworldly. It is completely bizarre. How do I understand Trump and Greenland and his re-invocation of the Monroe Doctrine? I think in many respects, Trump is a 19th century American president. And that if you put Trump in the broad swath of American history, he belongs among those like James Polk and William McKinley and others who believed in manifest destiny and the use of American force for territorial acquisition. And he talked about manifest destiny, Trump did, in his second inaugural address. And so when I hear Trump talk about Greenland, it reminds me of James Polk in the 1840s annexing Texas and then taking a big chunk of Mexico. It reminds me of the United States during the long 19th century, expanding westward to the Pacific. It reminds me of the era after the Civil War when the United States bought Alaska and thought about getting Greenland. It reminds me of 1898 when the United States picked a war with Spain and then took over Cuba and Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And so in some ways, I think Trump is looking at a map. He's thinking that, oh, Greenland is close, it's big, it's about the size of 25% of the American landmass, the contiguous 48 states. And he would say, you know, this is my legacy. This is what I want on my tombstone. He added Greenland to the United States. Is there a kind of strategic rationale? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that Greenland matters strategically. Yes, in the sense that there are minerals there. But the US can get everything it wants under the current situation. It has a 1951 agreement. It has a base, Pacific base, which is used as a place for the monitoring of missile launches, for low Earth satellites. It is important to controlling what's called the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. So the United States doesn't need to own Greenland to deal with its strategic interests. And as a consequence, I find it very hard to contemplate why Trump would talk about the use of military force, which would effectively mean an armed attack against a NATO ally, which would effectively mean the end of NATO and the Atlantic Alliance.
Yeah, actually, my next question will be about this topic, because let's imagine that Trump annexes Greenland or forces Denmark to sell the island to USA. What would it mean for global security architecture and how autocracies around the world perceive this precedent?
You know, I could imagine a situation in which Greenland one day becomes part of the United States, or it ends up in a status similar to territories that are part of the United States but not in the Union. But that's going to take a long time, and it needs to occur consensually. And the idea that somehow Trump is going to hold a gun to the head of Greenlanders and to the head of Danish government, and they're going to say, oh, yes, Mr. Trump, we want to join the United States. We're going to sell you Greenland. It's not going to happen. And as a consequence, I have a hard time imagining what the end game is here. And I don't believe, it's hard for me to really believe that if there isn't a decision by Greenland and Denmark for Greenland to be bought by the United States, that Trump would then resort to military force. Now Trump does weird things, as you put it. Trump is unpredictable. Trump has broken the mold of post-World War II American foreign policy. Trump doesn't seem to care about international law or domestic law. But attacking an ally, going to war against Denmark, against Greenland, perhaps other European countries would join in to defend Greenland. It's just difficult to imagine. And I think it really would mean the effective end of a stable international order anchored by the United States. And it's hard for me to imagine that any ally of the United States, whether it is Japan or South Korea or Germany or France or Denmark, would remain in an alliance if they think the United States has returned to the path of imperial conquest.
According to official statement of US Department of State, the Western Hemisphere is a sphere of US interest. Does it mean that in Trump's administration perception, world has to be divided into different spheres of influence, like after the Second World War?
Well, there's no question that in rhetoric and in action, the Trump administration has gone back to the Monroe Doctrine and sees the United States as a zone of American influence. That's not new, right? The Monroe Doctrine was promulgated in 1823. It was then formally enforced in 1898. The United States has been intervening in Latin America regularly ever since. The United States has been the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere ever since. And so what you're seeing is not the return, but just the continuation of a policy that has always been there, but that the Trump administration feels that it needs to beat its chest, to talk about it openly, and to topple the regime, or at least to grab Maduro in Venezuela as an exercise of American power, alongside strikes on boats that are allegedly running drugs, alongside threats to neighbors in Latin America that might not be doing enough to stem the flow of immigration. Now, what's kind of contradictory or hard to understand about the Trump administration is that this focus on the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine, the America First Committee that opened its doors in 1941. This was about Western Hemispheric isolation, that the United States should focus only on the Western Hemisphere and stay out of entanglements elsewhere. That was American isolationism, and that was really the policy until 1941 in Pearl Harbor. And then the US goes out, continues to dominate the Western Hemisphere, but then becomes a global power and deploys forces in Europe and in Asia and in the Middle East. And so the original version of the America First Doctrine was hemispheric isolation. We are now reinforcing hemispheric hegemony, but not isolation. American forces are still in Europe. They're still in Japan. They're still in South Korea. They're still in Qatar. They're still in Bahrain. They're all over the place. Now, whether Trump is actually going to move in the direction of detaching the United States, of disentangling the United States from those far-flung commitments, we don't know. Mm-hmm. My guess is he's not going to.
Yeah, but in general, this so-called Donroe doctrine, not Monroe, but Donroe doctrine, like Donald Trump doctrine, where could lead this doctrine in terms of world security architecture and development of democracy?
Well, it's conceivable that the Trump administration has a view of global politics that entails the assertion of great power spheres of influence. And that's one of the reasons that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin may be very happy about what Trump has done in Venezuela, because it says, hey, great powers can do what they want to in their neighborhood. If Trump can take over Venezuela, then we Russians can take over Ukraine. Is that the vision in Trump's head? I don't know. It doesn't look that way, because Trump doesn't seem ready to hand Ukraine off to Russia. On the other hand, he's not doing a lot to defend Ukraine. The national security strategy says, yes, we're going back to the Monroe Doctrine, but we're going to defend Taiwan and freedom of navigation up to the first island chain. That's not great power spheres of influence. That's American hegemony, and that's the forward deployment of American forces. Were we to go back to that world, it would really be going back to the 19th century. It would be going back to a world of great power imperialism, of great power spheres of influence. It would mean the end of a liberal, rules-based international system. We know that Trump doesn't like much the liberal, rules-based international system. He doesn't like rules, period, whether domestic rules or international rules. But whether he, in fact, is the president who presides over the demolition of that order and brings us back to the 19th century, right now it's too soon to tell. I think the Europeans and other allies are doing the right thing by trying to keep Trump in the game, by holding him close, by engaging with him. Here today in Washington, the Danish and the Greenlander foreign ministers are meeting with Vance and Rubio. That's what they should be doing. Because I think if Trump is left to his own devices, he might well bring down that order. And that's why it's so important for Europeans and other democratic allies to stay in the game. One final comment. You mentioned the promotion of democracy. There isn't any, right? Trump has basically said, we're done with that. And on some level, it's the right thing to do, because I think Biden put too much emphasis on this global clash between democracy and autocracy. I think Trump is right to talk to Putin. I think he's right to talk to Xi Jinping. Democracies and autocracies need to work together. That having been said, I think that Trump is turning the United States into a normal power. It is giving up on the exceptionalist mission of trying to spread democracy, of trying to spread freedom, of trying to make the world a place that plays by the rules of rationalism and law and not by power politics. And that's a very serious setback in my mind for historical progress. And I would predict that it's not going to play well with the American public, for whom American exceptionalism and an American effort to change the world for the better is in our DNA.
Yeah, I understand you. I understand what you're talking about. Let's talk about Russia. How would you assess current political and economic capabilities of Russia in terms of its ability to continue a long-term war of attrition against Ukraine?
You know, one hears predictions that Russia is on its last gasp, and that if only Trump were to put sanctions on this company, or to go after the shadow fleet, or to put tariffs on countries that buy Russian oil, then the Russian economy is going to collapse. I don't buy it. I think that Russia is now on a war footing. I think that the Russian economy has weathered the sanctions. I think the Russians can generally get what they need by dealing with countries with whom they've established new trading relationships since the sanctions first kicked in 2014 and then again in 2022. And so I don't think that we will stop Russian aggression against Ukraine by getting the Russians to say, oh, it hurts too much. Our economy is stumbling. We're ready to stop. I think Putin is prepared to make the domestic economic sacrifices necessary to keep this war going. And as a consequence, I think there's only one way to get the Russians to stop, and that's to stop them. And that means giving Ukrainians the economic and military assistance that they need to shut down Russian aggression. I think that Putin will, in the end of the day, agree to a diplomatic end to this war, but only if he believes that Russian forces are going to get have gotten as far as they are going to get. And we're not there yet. I think Putin believes that he can win. I think Putin believes that time is on his side. And that's why it is so important for Trump to step up to the plate and say to Putin, time is not on your side. We are prepared to stand by Ukraine. We are standing shoulder to shoulder with European allies to give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself.
I would like to expand our discussion about sanctions. Trump has agreed the Gramm-Blumenthal sanction bill against those who buy Russian oil. First of all, is it intimidation or real intention? And what implications would have new sanctions for China, India, and Brazil? How they would circumvent these sanctions, and what Russia is going to do under such circumstances?
Well, I don't think we're going to see those kinds of sanctions implemented. Trump has really only moved ahead in one case, and that is India, where he increased sanctions against India for buying Russian oil. And that is in part, and in fact, I would say mainly, because he was in a spat with Prime Minister Modi, because Modi stood up to him. And because Modi didn't agree with Trump that he ended the war between India and Pakistan, didn't make a deal with Trump on trade, and wasn't taking the knee, if you will, as others did. Trump wants a trade deal with China. Trump, I think, is very focused on setting the ground for a visit to China. We're hearing it will be in April, and getting a breakthrough on trade. And as a consequence, I really don't believe that we're going to see these high towering levels of tariffs on China because China buys Russian oil. So it's for this reason, among others, that I don't believe that economic sanctions are the answer. In the end of the day, Putin will stop when he is stopped, and that's much more about aiding Ukraine than it is about sanctioning Russia.
What is the most important for Trump right now in terms of domestic policy and foreign affairs? I mean, where is his real focus on in view of the midterm elections?
Trump is in trouble. Trump has delivered really on only one main campaign promise, and that is on his immigration platform, where he said he was going to shut down the southern border and engage in massive deportation. And he's generally delivered. And on a daily basis now, you pick up the newspaper, you turn on the television, and you see pictures of agents rounding up immigrants, arresting immigrants, deporting them all over the place. And in that sense, he did what he promised he would do, but it's not going over well. The deportation campaign is really quite inhumane and shocking, and public opinion polls are showing that roughly 2/3 of the American public doesn't support Trump's immigration policy. And it is causing very significant disruptions to the labor supply. Why? Because undocumented migrants work in construction, in hospitality, restaurants and hotels, in food processing, in gardening, in agriculture. People are having a hard time finding workers. People aren't going to work because they're afraid if they go out on the street, they're going to get arrested. So this is very disruptive. And then on the other main promise, affordability, Trump has taken steps that are actually making economic insecurity worse. In particular, the tariffs, where you see rising costs, particularly in grocery stores. And Trump said, well, everybody is going to move to the United States. All these companies are going to come back and they're going to build things here because they don't want to get hit with tariffs. And the United States will be the manufacturing powerhouse of the world again. Not happening. Since Trump took office, around 50,000 manufacturing jobs have disappeared. And so average working Americans don't get their jobs back on the production line. The cost of living keeps going up. They are very unhappy. And that's precisely why you're seeing Trump's support in public opinion go down, and why Republican members of Congress, just in the last few weeks, have really begun to push back and move away from him. I would say we're at a bit of a tipping point in the Trump presidency, in which his ability to dominate American politics has cracked, and in which the Democrats are, I would say, in decent shape heading into the midterms.
Yeah, and actually, what about foreign affairs?
In foreign affairs, I would say kind of mixed. Is Trump on shaky ground with his voter base? Yes. Because he promised an America First foreign policy. He promised that we'd spend more time solving problems at home rather than solving problems abroad. He's talked about the Monroe Doctrine and the United States no longer being the atlas of the world as it was put in the national security strategy. Well, yeah, there is this new Monroe Doctrine, but U.S. is also still playing the world's policeman. The U.S. has not just gone in and toppled Maduro, but it's carried out airstrikes in Iran, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Nigeria. There are still 80,000 U.S. troops in Europe, tens of thousands of American troops in Japan and South Korea, U.S. troops on station in hundreds of bases around the world. And I don't think that the base is very happy about this. I'm guessing that J.D. Vance, who in some ways represents the neo-isolationist quadrant within the Trump administration, I don't think he was very happy about going into Venezuela. What if Venezuela starts going in an unstable direction? What if the United States needs to put boots on the ground? And so I think on foreign policy, it's a very mixed picture. And I give Trump credit for trying to be the peacemaker. And he did get a ceasefire of sorts in Gaza, even though the violence continues. He's trying his best to end the war in Ukraine, although I think he has misread Putin and doesn't understand the ideological ambitions that drive Putin. So in some ways, I would say his foreign policy rhetorically is a huge break. But in reality, it isn't all that different from what we've seen before. The big caveat is Greenland. Were he to go into Greenland, I think it really would be a historic breakpoint in America's relationship with its allies.
If I understood you correctly, you tend to think that Republicans don't have many chances to win midterm elections.
You know, I would be more cautious than that. It's going to be tight. There are redistricting efforts afoot. Republicans are now thinking that maybe they need to pass a bill to extend healthcare subsidies because they're concerned that the bill that's facing many Americans, the healthcare bill, is really going to turn Republican voters away from the administration alongside this affordability crisis that I talked about. So things are a bit up in the air. But I do think if you look at public opinion polls, if you look at the decisive victories that Democratic candidates won in the governor elections in Virginia and New Jersey, the Democrats are in pretty good shape to take back the House. But we're in a very fluid and uncertain period in American politics, and anything could happen between now and the elections in the fall.
Charles, thank you very much for this interview. I appreciate your expertise. Say you thank you again, and have a good day.
It's been my pleasure to join you. Let's stay in touch.
Yeah, thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.